Yes, yesterday I read some news.
还是朝鲜的发言，都给对方
Despite the statement of President Trump or the statement of North Korea, both sides still leave some maneuver for a discussion. So I'm confident that peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula have to be maintained. And it's between North Korea and the US right now. And a summit is needed to achieve a breakthrough. I often believe that to achieve the best result, you've got to wait for a long time. But in order to settle this issue, I believe we have to be full of hope. And hope is about the theme of this forum.
Do you have any advice to the world in terms of how to deal with President Trump? Because you were somebody who was associated with the election of President Trump, and yet you look and see what has happened. There are many people here under sanctions. He has just withdrawn from the Iran deal. There are doubts about the North Korean deal. What do you think you have got from the relationship with him? The same question that I asked Mr. Macron.
Провокатор.
Well, he's an agent provocateur.
Но мы, конечно, не можем быть удовлетворены.
Well, certainly, we cannot be satisfied with the current level and the nature of the American-Russian relations. And we're willing to engage in this dialogue. Mr. Trump has suggested that a separate meeting should be held. So far, we didn't manage to work it out yet because many issues are popping up. But we are willing to have this conversation, a substantive one. I think it's high time we're engaged in that. We need a multilateral approach like that on many domains. Donald Trump has expressed a concern about a new arms race, and I concur with him fully. The measures that we are talking about in North Korea, Iran, they're not bringing us together, but that is another reason to talk about these matters. Emmanuel has said that Europe and the United States have mutual obligations. Europe is dependent on the US in terms of security, but one shouldn't be alarmed. We'll help. We'll help ensure the security. And in any case, we're going to do everything in our power so as to avoid any new threats. I think this is the avenue we should be pursuing. That's the first thing. Secondly, I'll enter sort of a discussion with President of France, who said that Donald Trump lost because he pulled out from the Iranian deal. I don't think he lost. First and foremost, he is just doing good on his electoral promises, and in that sense is a victor domestically. But should this deal be demolished for good, then many will stand to lose.
Straight ahead, frank talk about economic sanctions. Are they still effective?
The Russian economy is evidently stable, despite, triple or double shocks related to the price decline. So it all came upon us simultaneously. We were able to persevere.
Welcome back to the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Building a trust economy was the central theme of the conference. Russia's Vladimir Putin and France's Emmanuel Macron engaged directly on the issue of how to foster trust, build cooperation, and maintain global security.
Je veux rassurer Vladimir. Je n'ai pas peur parce que.
I'd like to assure Vladimir that I'm not afraid at all, because France has armed forces that are fully capable of protecting the country, but I've got some obligations, commitments with regard to our European allies. I believe the current architecture of European security that I've just talked about is an area of our responsibility. Anyway, we're not going to turn our backs on one another, and we couldn't ensure security to the detriment of others, and that is how we should act. I think I'm not afraid, and I'd like to express my responsibility and make good on it. Well, certainly one shouldn't be afraid. But you see, the practice is there. We are talking about Iran all the same, but there was the practice of the US sanctions used against European economic operators. We saw an example, 9 billion, I think, Paribas, French bank, Deutsche Bank, they were fined for breach of unilateral sanctions, and they had no choice but to pay up. And I think the same happened to Japanese bank. And this is something we have to put an end to, because that is unacceptable. That is what I'm talking about. And should this practice continue, nothing good will come out of it, because that undermines the current world order. We've got to agree with our American counterparts on some joint rules of game, because that is very important, because that what underlies our current discussion, trust. That if it's either there or not, if there is no trust, then nothing good will come out of it. And as I said when I spoke, apart from the element of force, nothing will be left in international affairs, and that will result in tragedy. I share your point of view fully. Everything you said about financial issues and economic matters, there is no doubt about that. That is something I also spoke about. We've got to build a stable, a useful world order, and that will rest on multilateralism and sovereignty. And sovereignty presupposes respect for the interests of citizens and companies who are dependent on their country. And in that sense, we concur fully, and we have to have the necessary tools, and that is something we've got to reach an agreement with the US. And there's something I'd like to say. I wanted to ensure our sovereignty, and all the decisions I made once I entered into office was to that end. And as for security, there is no suspicion there at all. We have common history. We have the collective system of defense and security that is very important for Europe and for the US. And I think that the mistake that was made over the last 2 decades consisted in the fact that through NATO we did manage to make good on all the commitments that we undertook in the past, and that was not very just, and we didn't show enough trust which Russia could count. I have to tell you the truth here. That's why I've come here. Yes, in terms of financial, economic, sovereignty, trade and security, the EU, France and Russia have to build a new architecture which will help us advance in an atmosphere of trust.
President Putin, if you look around this room, you would seem to be evidence that sanctions do not work. Virtually everyone I meet here has been sanctioned in some way, and yet Russian business continues to thrive. Do sanctions still have any effect at all?
It's really not about the results of the so-called sanctions and restrictions being applied, and the fact that the people are here who feel what it is, understand what it is, they encounter what this is. A prevalent majority of them is here because this sanctional club this baton is being applied more and more often, and not only with respect to Russia. Now, is it good or bad? Can it be overcome or not? Well, certainly. The Russian economy is evidently stable, despite, triple or double shocks related to the price decline on our traditional exports, staples, energy, metals, chemicals, the sanctional pressure on top of it. So it all came upon us simultaneously, but we were able to persevere and pass through it, and to a certain extent we're able to strengthen our economy, and I'm very grateful to Christine. She specifically, described what should be considered a positive thing in the development of the Russian economy, i.e. the macroeconomic component.
I just would like to make one point, and it's certainly not for me to have an opinion on what is national security, and the leaders here are much better at that. But when we decide to rebuild, reorganize, redefine the architecture of the international order and the multilateralism, I think we need to be really careful as to the transparency and the actual impact, because while we are referring to decisions that have been made by Mr. Trump recently, the ambiguity that is embedded in the US national law system has actually affected many companies that are represented here. Even when the United States and its allies decided to lift the sanctions on Iran, many companies here in this room did not do business with Iran, or they used some very funny financial circuits involving some strange banks sometimes in order to do business with Iran, simply because the US legal system and judiciary system is such circumvoluted and obscure constructively for the US interests that there is no confidence, even though the sanctions had been lifted. So I think in rebuilding and redesigning, the actual impact at home, domestically, in the various countries that are party to those agreements really need to be clarified. And that applies to the sanctions that have been decided against some Russian individuals as well, where there is great uncertainty as to whether or not they are targeted themselves, their shareholding in companies, the companies themselves, some holdings, large territories of their corporate empire. So that is a real issue of confidence that is simply not there and needs to be addressed.
Coming up, coverage of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum continues on the topic of global trust and global trade.
We need to avoid any trade war because there won't be any winners in such a war.
Wirecast.
You're watching the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, moderated by Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite, who asked IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde about recent disputes over global trade.
The other side of the trade dispute, of the biggest trade dispute at the moment, is China.
Trade has been good to China. And trade has been good to many other countries as well in improving living standards, in lifting people out of poverty, and in acting as a driver for growth. And trade is a driver for growth around the world and has been. Now, after 10 years of depressed growth and depressed trade, trade is finally picking up and finally growing faster than global growth. So it's really an imperative not just for China, but for all countries that rely on trade for their growth, to defend the international order in which trade is operated. Now, as I understand it, the complaint that the US has vis-à-vis China is of two different natures. One is China sells more than it buys from the US, and that is the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. It's a very strange way to look at the balancing act around the world. And one country should not look at one single deficit with another country, but its overall position vis-à-vis the rest of the world. That's how it really works. And it's, you know, a strange complaint. The second side of the complaint of the United States is that in the trade game that is played by all, the allegation against China is that it does not respect the intellectual property rights. It forces transfers of technology when it accepts foreign direct investors in China. It subsidizes some of its state-owned enterprises. And according to the allegations, it is unfair trade practices that need to be investigated, looked into, and eventually sanctioned. And if that is true, well, there is a forum to debate those issues, and the WTO, to which China is a party, to which the United States is a party, which it was an original founder of, should be the forum where that is debated. And then it's a question of making sure that decisions made are effectively implemented by China.
Vice President Wang Shishan, I see you have applauded Mrs. Lagarde. Do you see?
He always does.
How do you see China approaching this dispute? Is this an area where America has got it completely wrong, or is there room for China to open up its markets?
But historically, I did some work as a deputy chairman of the State Council when I was overseeing the issues of our relationship with the United States. In as far as the trade war is concerned between China and US, between our two countries, at a very fast pace, very often we are holding consultations. And I believe that we must act in a reserved manner, and we should not be emotional about it. The China chairman, Xi Jinping, he once stated that China is not afraid of anything, but it doesn't make sense for China to provoke an incident. We believe that in any case we need to avoid any trade war because there won't be any winners in such a war, like the case was in the example of the war between England and France. 100 years it lasted for, but in the textbooks about history, there's only one line describing it, which says that France took a great victory in that war. And the current world and mutual benefit or zero-sum. This is a very serious matter, and the Chinese government has always been following the principles of mutual benefit, because that is something that will bring good to all of the peoples of the world.
Do you still think that China can learn from America, or do you think it has now passed it?
There are a lot of things that we can learn from America because America is the only global superpower. Despite the soft power or the hard power, they're still number one. This is the biggest developed country and China, the biggest emerging country, the first economy and the second economy in terms of volume. And so we need to cooperate, and we know quite well about it. Without a single emotion, we should try to achieve the best possible results, but we should be ready to face any circumstances. And that is the wisdom of the philosophy of the Chinese people.
Still ahead, more from the presidential plenary of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum brought world leaders face-to-face on stage. Moderator John Micklethwaite concluded the presidential plenary by asking how Europe and Russia might establish more constructive cooperation.
You come here to make your case on Iran, you come here to make your case on other things. What is your view about what is the best way for Russia to rebuild its ties with the West?
We need to maintain a continuous dialogue. We also need to do some good, fruitful work in the area of collective security, specifically as far as the Middle East is concerned. Yesterday, I believe that we have advanced ourselves quite well along such important issues like Iran, to ensure that the 2015 agreement prevails and try to further work negotiating about it. With respect to Syria, we also undertook a joint humanitarian initiative, as well as we have agreed upon the way the mechanism existing between ourselves should further work. I mean, the Astana group and the so-called the smaller group, which was initiated by France several months ago, with a number of permanent Security Council, UN Security Council members, the UK, the US, as well as Germany, as well as certain other regional nations such as Jordan and Egypt. And so we agreed to set up a coordination mechanism so as to be able to work within a single agenda, so as together work to put together a common roadmap in order to ensure a good future for Syria, to ensure peaceful sovereignty, and which would be an inclusive one in terms of the the processes taking place in this country. And further on, we should together build our future in Europe in a geopolitical sense as well, because I presume that this is something that this depends upon our capability to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. And so, and as far as this matter is concerned, we've got the Minsk Accord, we have the normative format within which we're going to continue to act. Apart from that, we need to continue a strategic dialogue on the matters of security, cyberspace, and economics. And that is exactly what we've been busy with together. And we've envisaged a very specific action, because I'm sure that you noted that we've signed about 50 agreements in the economic strategic areas, very important ones, as well as in the area of the cyberspace. We also agreed to work together in order to develop and put together a single charter within which we'll be able to resolve different disputes. And that is a very important point, in strategic as well.
Can you see Russia being part of the European Union?
Je pense, il ne m'appartient pas ça de le dire, moi je suis...
I think that one should be cautious about any possible expansion, because there used to be a bit of an euphoria on the part of the European Union. But when you are expanding without reforming anything, that really doesn't come out very effectively. So it seems to me that the European Union should be more sovereign, more unified, more democratic, and should understand what is its strategic priorities. So I believe that there is a bit of a centralized union which shares certain rules from the point of view of taxation, as well as from the point of view of labor regulation. But there is also another Europe which is somewhat in other regions, which is not part of this centralized nucleus. And in this sense, of course, Russia has a place in such a Europe. And so I often think about the Russia's place in the Council of Europe, because the common space of law and values which identifies our countries as a broader Europe, I believe this is quite feasible, and I believe that certain work needs to be put into it. Reform is necessary on the part of the European Union, but on top of that, I believe that it's very important for us to enjoy very deep common strategic projects for the future years to come.
So Russia could end up in the same place as Britain?
Ça dépend de vous deux, si je puis utiliser cette plaisanterie.
That really depends upon the two of you. If you allow me to express this joke to you, dear John, there are certain points in history when fear may push one to make certain decisions. I do not think that we're doomed to that, but we do carry a lot of responsibility at the point in time when we here talk about it.
President Putin, what is your goal for Russia and the West? Where do you want to see Russia and the West? Despite all these misunderstandings, we could have gone through many other ones. Where do you actually want to take Russia? Do you want St. Petersburg, this place which is seen as the symbol of the Western capital of Russia? Can you imagine this again being integrated into Europe in the sort of way that Mr. Macron described?
Every nation has its national priorities and its own interests. And I spoke about it in the course of my presentation here, and we will certainly be striving to achieve our national interests now in terms of what they are today and for the foreseeable future, first and foremost in our internal development, because we need to provide for the growth of labor productivity in this country's economy. We need to create terms and conditions to attract investment, because without investments it would be impossible to resolve another problem. It would be impossible to diversify our economy. Madame Lagarde yesterday told me about it and also made a hint at that today as well. We've got 4.5% of growth of investment into the fixed capital last year, while the economic growth was 1.1%, which was a good indicator, an accelerated investment. But that is not enough, absolutely not enough. But in order for us to be able to attract capital from friendly companies and nations, we need to maintain good relations with Europe, with the rest of the world, with the United States as well. We're very well aware of this. But if we are to be forced into a choice, should we exist as a sovereign state or certain restrictions should be imposed upon us, we will certainly go for the first option. Because These substances which are put upon the scales are incompatible in existence of a nations or certain investments as a pittance of a sort. We are trying to achieve the kind of investments so as to bring back or establish the new rules of the games in the area of security and the international policy with the help of the currently existing institutions, which definitely should further evolve. But on that particular ground, we want to resolve the following matter: to diversify Russia's economy, to make it innovative. We want to work over artificial intellect and technology development. And actually, Christine expressed some concern over the robotics and the loss of employment. This is not so much fearful, I should say, although these kinds of phobias do exist and people fear this. And there is a danger of this, but as deemed by the international experts, only 5% of workplaces globally could be completely automated, and only 10% have already been automated out of what can be done right now. So there's a lot of room both for the Russian economy as well as the global economy, and upon this ground we want to achieve the most important objective. We want to raise the level, the quality of our life. We want to reduce the number of people who live below the poverty line. We want to achieve the situation whereby the biggest performance indicator, the lifespan, should increase up to 78 years by 2024, and by 2030 for it to be 80 plus. This is everything feasible, but amongst other conditions, favorable external conditions are necessary, and we're going to do everything we can in order to achieve it without forgetting that, and that is also the point of our national interest, but at the same time, we cannot sacrifice our sovereignty and our fundamental interests. So I hope that this equilibrium between Russia and our partners will be found.
Can I ask you one final question? Is who will win the World Cup?
The organizers will win, who at a respective level will organize this excellent festivity for the whole of the international community, for all of those who love this excellent international game. That is what we see as our ultimate objective, but in as far as the winning team is concerned, as they say, the strongest shall win. And I would very much like this to be a real celebration for all those who love the sports, both for the football players and for our guests. We will do everything for both the fans and the players to feel in Russia like home.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry if I missed some of your own questions, but thank you.
And on my part, and on behalf of all my colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude to our moderator today, because I believe it was done in a very professional way. You've managed to really turn this discussion into a very lively, very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Saudi Arabia gather to talk, OPEC Plus thinking of ramping up production. Market hinges on by how much. Storm Central. Storm season picks up in the U.S. We dissect the biggest risk to crops this summer. Tariff time. Clock runs out on Mexico, Canada, and the EU to get exemptions from steel and aluminum tariffs. The fallout from trade breakdown.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
I'm Alex Steele, and welcome to Bloomberg Commodities Edge. It's 30 minutes focused on the companies, the physical assets, and the trading behind the hottest commodities with the smartest voices in the business. Well, our top story today is tariffs. The Trump administration announcing that it will impose tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee is live at the G7 ministers meeting in Whistler, British Columbia, and Bloomberg's metal and mining reporter Joe Doe joins me here in New York. Mike, what has been the response of world leaders?
Well, Alex, we are starting to see the retaliatory lists come out, and appropriately enough for your show, it is commodities that lead the list. The European Union out with their reaction earlier today. The European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker saying it's a sad day for world trade. The U.S. tariffs are unjustified. It is protectionism, pure and simple. He says it leaves the EU with nothing to do but retaliate. They're going to look at agricultural products and then some of the things that they've talked about before, including Kentucky bourbon, blue jeans from San Francisco, the Levi's blue jeans, and also bourbon whiskey from the state of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's hometown. The Mexican government has come out with a response. The Economy Ministry saying that Mexico deeply rejects and regrets the decision of the United States. They're going to look at steel, pork legs, sausages, apples, blueberries, cranberries, and some cheeses, among other things. Canadian officials say they have drawn up a list. They won't say what is on it, but Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne said today Donald Trump is a bully, and the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up and push back. We have to do that. A number of GOP senators also calling the tariffs a mistake. The question is, now that the retaliation lists are starting to come out, what does the U.S. do next? Do they escalate? We asked Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross earlier today about that, and he said they would have to see what the other countries do first and then make a decision. Alex?
Well, good stuff. And then, Joe, it raises the question, who is the most to lose? I mean, you take a look at, say, steel imports from Canada, from Mexico, from the EU. Who is more exposed to this?
Right. So Canada accounts for about 16% of our total imports. Canada, Mexico, EU combined is about 40% of all our imports. The EU is at about 15%. So let's get away from percentages, right? It essentially is telling us Canada, in terms of an exporter to the U.S., is huge both in steel and aluminum. Aluminum, they account for about 51% of our consumption. Total consumption here in the United States. So the Canadians obviously very worried about what this might mean. We're expecting Trudeau to come out with some sort of announcement later today, and that also could not only be their disappointment that this has happened, but also some sort of retaliatory measures.
That aluminum, if it doesn't come to the U.S., where does it go?
Well, there is a possibility that it doesn't come to the U.S. If it goes elsewhere, well, the question is, where do people want to send it? The obvious one that they could send it to is the EU, right? Because this is developed, part of the world. There is a lot of economic growth there, and that's why the EU is actually worried, right? So politically, they say we're going to put up retaliatory measures with relation to steel and aluminum, but actually they practically have to do it on a practical level, because people are going to say, well, where do we send our metal? If we can't send it to the U.S. because of that tax that we have to pay, they say, well, let's send it to someplace like the EU, so they have to put up their own barriers. And then you're basically playing a sort of whack-a-mole. Everybody's just trying to put up their own barriers to prevent dumping going into their regions or their countries.
And we just had a full screen up of the major aluminum and steel stocks. What was interesting to me is that Alcoa was not actually rallying on the day, unlike, say, Century Aluminum or U.S. Steel. What's the deal with that?
Alcoa produces more aluminum in Canada than they do in the United States. They are a truly global company. Sure, they're the American aluminum producer, but they do far more outside of the U.S. than they do inside the U.S. That's why they have been very patient and they've paid attention to their language very closely. They haven't been supporting Trump wholeheartedly. They've been saying we really need to focus on the real problem, which is Chinese overcapacity, and that is why today you're seeing Alcoa not perform the way that you're seeing Century and the other U.S. steel makers.
All right, thank you very much, Joe Doe, Bloomberg's Bloomberg's metal and mining's reporter, and Michael McKee, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. All right, now let's move to Spot On. It's our investor take on our big story, and the spotlight is still on trade. WTO Director Roberto Azevedo talked to Bloomberg about the risks of a trade war.
Once you get down that road, it's much more difficult to backtrack and reverse course.
Well, joining me now is Jonathan Goldberg, BBL Commodities founder and CIO. John, good to see you. What is the impact on commodities?
It's a tricky question to answer because with all things Trump related, you never quite know where the end game is. But when we're looking at potential for a trade war and for tariffs, we're looking at first order impact in terms of commodity trade flows and then second order impacts in terms of demand. In terms of when, if, and how tariffs are applied, in the agriculture market, Chinese are a big buyer of U.S. soybeans. There's some talk just a week ago about purchasing more soybeans, purchasing more U.S. crude oil. If this escalates, that would obviously change. But with the U.S. already trading at a significant discount in terms of WTI prices relative to global prices, it would be more a shift in trade flows than an absolute decline in U.S. exports to China. The other key concern for us is levels of overall demand. One of the key underpinnings of the oil rally has been global demand's been fantastic for the last 12 months. If this gets out of hand, that would be a significant challenge for the oil story.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can take a look at, say, global demand. Many see, say, 1.6 million barrels a day of growth, and that would be the positive. But it raises the question on how tight the market is. Where are we with OECD inventories? If we need that demand to keep the market tight, that might have some severe implications.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the market outlook right now in the near term is quite good. Inventories are low. Inventories relative to demand, so in terms of days of forward cover, extremely tight. It's one of the tightest markets that we've seen in years. So the front end of the curve is very well supported, and we see that with very strong refining margins in Europe. We see that with very strong crude prices in Asia now. That story can continue as long as the demand numbers stay strong, and as long as OPEC and Russia maintain their production cuts in the middle of June, which is the next big story that we're going to see. I think the other tangent on tariffs that we need to consider is that with Trump, there's generally a first move and then a second move to the extent that there's a plan. One thing that we're very closely looking at as the second order impact of this potential escalation in tariffs is this a bargaining chip for something? And could that be stricter adherence to the Iranian sanctions that we're trying to impose?
Meaning that we'll trade you some tariffs if you support us with Iranian sanctions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yesterday, Reliance came out and said they were going to be reducing their purchases of Iranian crude by about 100,000 barrels a day. We'll see if that's part of the broader play here.
So for the broader impact then, if you take a look at oil volatility, it's been very soft for a while, but it's starting to pick up. Can you wrap all this up in a bow and say we're just going to have to be more nimble, we're going to see more volatility?
I think that's fair. So over the last years, oil prices have rallied. Any measure of speculative length in the market has also increased dramatically. Whether it's in dollar terms or in barrel terms, the market is at or around and near an all-time high in terms of spec length. There's sort of two camps about why people are long. On the one hand, there's the structural argument, and that argument is that investments in oil are declining, and we need to bring more dollars to the market over time to fill a supply gap. And on the other hand, there's this a near-term story. It's driven by OPEC constraint, it's driven by Russia constraint, and it's driven by strong demand. We're very much in the second camp. We think that this market can and will change, and that to the extent that Russia and Saudis put more oil on the market, we're going to look at a very, very different market in the next 12 months. So we think the next month or two are going to be a very, very key inflection point for the markets.
The other part of the market that's sort of devoid of the huge macro is what's happening here in the U.S., in particular what's happening in the Permian Basin, the differentials that are just blowing out between Midland and Houston. Talk about some volatility. And I spoke to the Apache CEO yesterday, and he talked about what he sees going forward.
Administration of Wirecast.
This won't be a one-time thing. As you expand the basin over the next several years, there will need to be more pipes incrementally built. Differentials are going to blow out, and then they'll come back in.
So it's not only dealing with macro and the volatility, it's also going to be about regional volatility as well?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the microdynamics of oil right now are as volatile and as changing as the macro dynamics. I think his comments were spot on. We see a bottleneck in takeaway capacity for essentially the next year. By the end of 2019, there should be sufficient amount of pipeline to clear some of these bottlenecks and have U.S. crude trade more closely to where global crude prices are. But this has a big impact, and it has an impact on the one hand on U.S. crude differentials, which, as you mentioned, are trading nearly $20 a barrel cheaper to the global benchmark. And on the other hand, it's very bullish for global crude. And I say that because if the main source of non-OPEC supply is in the U.S., which it is, but we can't get that oil to the global markets, we're essentially starving it of the supply growth that we need, at least for the next 12 months until that pipeline capacity is built.
All right, John, let's get your takeaway. So here's the deal. OPEC really matters. You have volatility will wind up picking up. 2018 is bullish overall, but balances for 2019 need to be actively traded. John Goldberg, really great to see you from BBL Commodities founder and CIO.
Thank you very much.
All right, coming up, it's storm season. We're going to take a look at what it means for crop prices. You got soybeans, wheat, cotton, corn. Soybeans down over the 2% over the last week, and corn futures getting hit as well. This is Bloomberg Commodities Edge. I'm Alex Steele, and this is Bloomberg Commodities Edge. It's time now for the Data Dig, where we delve deep into some market trends. First up, natural gas inventory numbers out this week showed a build of 96 billion cubic feet, slightly below estimates, but the build really came in the Midwest as well as the East Coast. Well, the oil inventory numbers saw a pretty juicy crude drawdown. Exports are over 2 million barrels a day again, and refineries ramped up. Yes, you did have Cushing draws, were not as good as expected. expected, but nonetheless, overall, a relatively bullish view for inventories in the U.S. Now we want to dig even deeper into one of the biggest catalysts for commodities, hurricane season. Subtropical storm Alberto kicked off the Atlantic hurricane season a week early, but its remnants are still moving. It's now headed to the Great Lakes and potentially into Canada. So what's the impact for the crop commodities in the U.S.? Joining me now is Shenando Basu. He's a meteorologist and analyst at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Good to see you, Shenando.
Thanks for having me.
So what's the implication of Alberto?
So we just had planting season. Seeds are now in the soil, and it was just dry enough. It was actually a really good time for planting this year, and we've approached the 90% mark for a number of the soft commodities. Now with Alberto coming in, and also the second half of May having a nice storm system about every 4 or 5 days or so through the Midwest, it was just ideal to get those seeds sown and now get the planting season and growing season going.
Well, let's talk about the seasonality planting for soybeans, because we've had great crops before, but it seems like with that soil, we have even better soybean planting than we've ever had.
That's right, and I think market expectations are reflective of that. I think market players are expecting that yields will be quite good this year, with now Alberto giving a really nice boost to the start of the growing season.
And you can see that that blue line there is where we are right now on a seasonal basis, and the green line is the high of planting, or really almost at that point. The other part of it, aside from storm, has to do with a drought, and we're seeing some drier weather over on the west, the southwest. Walk me through what we're seeing.
That's correct. Right now, the drought monitor, we see a pretty critical drought on the southern and western portions, especially along Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and so on. I think the concern going forward is that this summer, if it ends up being a very hot and dry one and that drought spreads, the need for irrigation will certainly increase, but the biggest pain point could actually be within the Corn Belt in the Midwest, across Indiana, Ohio. This region, which doesn't have as much irrigation available, if the summer does end up being a hot and a dry one, could definitely put those crops at risk.
Is any of that priced into either of the markets?
Not yet. I don't think the market has caught on to that yet. I think some of the more global situations, such as the one in Brazil, has affected the prices of, say, sugar, for example, but nothing yet.
All right, Shenando Basu of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, thank you very much. Great to see you. Well, coming up, Wally Kendall, the founder of Shell Crescent USA, on why Appalachia is the place when it comes to petrochems. Next on Bloomberg Commodities Edge.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
and this is Bloomberg Commodities Edge. Let's turn now to Commodity in Chief, where we focus on one executive in the commodity world. And today, it's Wally Candle, founder of Shell Crescent USA. First, let's take a closer look at the company.
The number, $188 billion, the amount of money poured into the chemical industry in the U.S. Gulf Coast since the shale gas revolution started. Now, Appalachia wants a piece of the action. Here's how it works. A petrochem plant takes wet gas like ethane, takes it apart, and puts it back together as ethylene. Then that gas is transformed into polyethylene, which makes plastic. The pitch? The Shell Crescent. It's the home of wet gas from the Utica and Marcellus, and the region should supply 37% of the U.S. natural gas production by 2040. Input costs are cheaper, and 2/3 of U.S. demand is local. So far, only Shell is biting. Other companies like Exxon and Dow are sticking with the U.S. Gulf Coast. It's got exportability, transportation, and storage. The U.S. Gulf Coast has wooed more than 70% of the capital spend. What can the Shell Crescent do?
Well, I recently